Hi, loves, and welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the Fawn response when being direct felt unsafe. There's a label that gets handed out very easily to certain people, especially sensitive people, perceptive people, relational people. And that label is passive aggressive. So I'd like to talk about that. Not to defend against it, not to deny it, and not to argue with anyone who's ever used it, but to place it where it actually belongs. Because most of the time, what gets called passive aggression isn't aggression at all. It's actually untranslated truth. I'll start here. People don't become indirect because they're manipulative. They become indirect because directness was never safe. And that safety doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. It erodes slowly through tone, dismissal, correction, minimization, jokes, eye rolls, silence, through being told again and again, that's not what happened. That's not what I meant. You're reading into it. You're too sensitive. You're misunderstood. When someone lives inside an environment like that, their body learns something very quickly. Speaking plainly costs connection. So the system adapts. Not cleverly, not consciously, biologically. Indirect language isn't a strategy. It's a compromise. A way of staying in relationship without being erased completely. Here's the part that often gets missed. People who are labeled passive-aggressive are usually the ones trying the hardest not to rupture. They're tracking tone, timing, mood, power dynamics, history. They're feeling the room before they speak. They're testing whether truth is welcome today. That's not aggression. That's vigilance. And vigilance develops when clarity has been punished. I can trace this in my own life, back to moments where saying something plainly changed the entire atmosphere. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. When reality is consistently denied, language starts to fracture. You feel something, but the words for it don't land. You name something, but it's corrected. You try again. And now you're told your tone is the problem. So eventually, you stop naming things directly. Not because you don't know what's happening, but because you know exactly what will happen if you say it. This is how people learn to speak sideways. Gaslighting doesn't always look like manipulation. Sometimes it looks like confusion, or certainty, or calmness. Sometimes it looks like someone being very sure that their version of events is the only reasonable one. And when you live inside of that long enough, your nervous system learns that perception itself is dangerous. So you soften it. You hint. You imply. You hope someone will meet you halfway. And when they don't, you get labeled instead. Here's the irony. The same people who get called passive-aggressive are often the ones who can feel exactly what's happening in a room before anyone else does. They're not unclear. They're over-aware. But awareness without permission to speak turns inward and then leaks out sideways. And there's another layer here. Many people who receive this label grew up in systems where authority came before truth, where being good mattered more than being accurate, where harmony mattered more than honesty, where emotional clarity was framed as disruption. In those environments, language isn't a tool for connection. It's a test. Say it the right way, at the right time, with the right tone, without making anyone uncomfortable. That's not communication. That's choreography. I didn't lack honesty. I lacked a place where honesty could land. So when someone later says, "You're being passive-aggressive," what they're often responding to is the residue of years of language suppression. Not hostility, not manipulation, just a nervous system that learned to survive relationally. So I'll say this carefully. Indirect expression is not the end state. It's not the truth. It's what happens before truth becomes safe again. Healing doesn't mean staying indirect forever. It means rebuilding the capacity for clean language. But that rebuilding doesn't happen through shame. You don't shame someone into directness when directness was the original wound. You restore it through safety, through being believed, through having your perception met instead of corrected. This is where things change. When someone begins to trust their perception again, language reorganizes naturally. They stop hinting. But not because they're forcing themselves to be brave, but because they're no longer bracing for impact. Directness doesn't feel risky anymore. It feels clean. And interestingly, when that happens, the label disappears all on its own. Not because it was disproven, but because it was never accurate in the first place. The moment I stopped needing my reality validated or met, my language stopped fracturing. That's not confidence. That's coherence. So I'll leave you with this. If you've ever been called passive-aggressive, it doesn't automatically mean you did something wrong. It might mean you learned to speak in an environment that couldn't hear you. And if you're unlearning that now, if your words are getting simpler, quieter, more precise, that's not regression. That's integration. Directness isn't forceful. It's what remains when fear leaves the room. And doesn't need defending. That's where language comes home.